The Promise of Dawn. High in the misty mountains of Abawara, where the morning sun first kissed the earth each day, lived a young woman named Zora. Her fingers were blessed with the magic of creation, weaving tapestries so beautiful they seemed to capture the very essence of life itself. The people of her village said the spirits had gifted her at birth, for no one had ever seen such mastery of color and pattern in one so young. Zora's small hut sat at the edge of the village, its walls adorned with her creations. Streams of merchants would travel the treacherous mountain paths just to trade for her works, carrying tales of her talents to distant lands. Each morning, she would rise before the sun, light her clay lamp, and sit at her loom as the first golden rays filtered through the morning mist. The gentle click-clack of her wooden shuttle became part of the mountain's dawn chorus, joining the songs of birds and the whisper of wind through the tall grass. It was on such a morning that Kwesi first appeared in her doorway. Unlike the other merchants who came seeking her wares, he stood in silence, studying not her tapestries but the way her hands danced across the loom. His eyes, deep and thoughtful, followed every movement of her fingers as if trying to understand the source of their magic. "They say your weaving captures stories," he finally spoke, his voice as rich as honey wine. "But I see now they were wrong. Your weaving captures souls." Zora's hands stilled on the loom, and for the first time in her life, she felt her own soul flutter like a captured bird. Kwesi was different from the merchants she knew. His clothes spoke of distant travels, but his eyes held the warmth of home. He carried himself with the dignity of a man who had earned his place in the world, yet there was a gentleness in his manner that made her feel at ease. Over the next few months, Kwesi's visits became as regular as the rising sun. He would bring her threads of colors she had never seen before, indigo from the deep forest of the west, crimson from the coastal markets, and gold spun so fine it seemed to float on air. With each gift, he would sit and tell her stories of the lands where he had found them, painting pictures with his words as vivid as her tapestries. The village elders nodded approvingly at their growing closeness. "Kwesi has wisdom beyond his years," they would say. "He understands the value of things that cannot be measured in coins." And indeed, while other merchants haggled over prices, Kwesi never spoke of money when he visited Zora. Instead, he spoke of dreams, of building something beautiful together, of combining his knowledge of distant markets with her gift for creation. Their wedding was celebrated during the festival of the harvest moon, when the mountain air was sweet with the scent of ripening fruit and fresh grain. The entire village gathered to witness their union, and even the skeptical old women agreed they had never seen a more fitting match. Zora wore a dress she had woven herself, incorporating all the special threads Kwesi had brought her, each color representing a promise for their future together. In those early days, their life together seemed blessed by the ancestors themselves. Kwesi built them a new home, larger than Zora's old hut, with a special room for her weaving that caught the morning light perfectly. He expanded his trade routes, carrying her works to markets she had never dreamed of reaching, and returned with stories and materials that inspired new creations. Their evenings were filled with laughter and planning. Kwesi would spread his maps on the floor, tracing trade routes with his finger while Zora leaned against him, suggesting new designs inspired by the lands he described. They would stay up late into the night, sharing dreams and weaving plans as intricate as Zora's tapestries. Together, Kwesi would say, "We will build something greater than either of us could achieve alone." The villagers spoke of them as proof that the old ways still held true, that a marriage could be both a joining of hearts and a partnership of purposes. Young girls would peek through Zora's window, sighing dreamily as they watched Kwesi bring her new threads or help her arrange her loom. The young men would seek Kwesi's advice, hoping to learn how he had won such a prize. Even the mountain itself seemed to smile upon their union. That year, the rains came right on time, the crops grew tall and strong, and the winter was mild. Zora's weaving flourished under Kwesi's encouragement, and his trade prospered with the addition of her increasingly sophisticated works. They made plans to take on apprentices, to build a bigger workshop, to travel together to the distant markets Kwesi knew. But as the elders often warned in their evening stories, fortune is like the mountain weather, quick to change and impossible to predict. No one in the village could have guessed that the seeds of darkness were already taking root beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect union, or that Zora's greatest test would come not from the hardships of nature or the challenges of craft, but from the very person who had promised to be her partner in all things. As the sun set on their first year together, casting long shadows across the mountain paths, neither Zora nor Kwesi could foresee how their story would transform from a tale of love into a legend of courage, resilience, and the profound power of a woman's spirit. For now, they remained in the warmth of their beginning, like a tapestry only partially woven, its final pattern yet to be revealed. Shadows creeping. The change came with the winds of the dry season, subtle at first like the gradual yellowing of leaves before autumn. New traders began appearing in the village, younger men with sharp eyes and sharper tongues, who spoke of faster routes and newer ways of conducting business. They carried strange devices of brass and glass that could calculate profits in the blink of an eye, making Kwesi's carefully kept scrolls seem antiquated and slow. At first, Kwesi dismissed these changes with a confident laugh. "The old ways have served us well," he would tell Zora in the evening, his fingers tracing the familiar patterns of her latest weaving. "These young ones know nothing of building trust, of the relationships that make trade truly profitable." But there was a new tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before, a slight tremor in his hands when he unrolled his trading scrolls. The first real blow came when the merchant caravans from the eastern kingdoms began taking the new southern route, bypassing their mountain village entirely. The impact was immediate. Kwesi's regular buyers became irregular, then scarce. The precious threads and rare dyes he had always brought home to Zora grew harder to obtain. Their storehouse, once filled with goods from every corner of the known world, began to empty. Zora watched as Kwesi's confident stride became a worried pace. He spent longer hours poring over his calculations, muttering about cost and profits. The stories he shared in the evenings grew shorter, then ceased altogether, replaced by long silences or abrupt questions about their expenses. When she suggested using simpler threads for her weaving, adapting to their new circumstances, his response was sharp. "Is that what you think of me?" he snapped, his voice carrying an edge she had never heard before. "That I can't provide for my own wife? That I should let you work with inferior materials like a common village weaver?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy as storm clouds. Zora's hands stilled on her loom, her heart beating against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was not the voice of the man who had stood in her doorway 2 years ago, speaking of captured souls. This was something else, something that made the shadows in the corners of their home seem deeper and more threatening. Kwesi began making longer journeys, pushing further into unfamiliar territories in search of new trading opportunities. When he returned, his clothes would be dusty and his eyes haunted. He spoke of ruthless competition, of younger merchants undercutting prices, of traditional trading relationships crumbling like sandcastles before the tide. The precious gifts he had always brought for Zora became rare, then stopped altogether. It was during one of his longer absences that Zora first heard the whispers in the marketplace. Women spoke in hushed tones of seeing Kwesi in distant towns, not at the trading post but in the shadows of taverns. Some said he had been seen gambling with merchant sellers, others that he had been borrowing money from questionable sources. Zora dismissed these rumors at first, but they settled in her mind like seeds taking root in fertile soil. When Kwesi returned from that journey, she knew the whispers held truth. The smell of fermented palm wine clung to his clothes, and his eyes held a glassy sheen she had never seen before. He emptied his trading pouches on their table. Instead of the usual careful arrangement of goods and coins, there was only a handful of copper pieces and a few tarnished silver rings. "The markets were poor," he muttered, not meeting her eyes. "Things will improve next time." But things didn't improve. Kwesi began drinking from a clay pot he kept hidden in their storehouse, starting earlier each day. His absences from home grew more frequent, though his returns brought less and less trade goods. The careful records he had once kept fell into disarray, and when Zora tried to help organize them, he snatched them away with a snarl. "You think you understand trade just because you can weave pretty pictures," he spat, the sweet honey of his voice now turned to bitter gall. "Stay with your threads and leave the real work to me." The village elders noticed the change in him. They would watch with concerned eyes as he stumbled home in the evenings, his once proud posture now stooped and unsteady. Some tried to counsel him, speaking of wisdom and patience, of weathering hard times with dignity. But Kwesi's responses grew increasingly hostile until even his oldest friends stopped trying. Zara found herself walking on tiptoes in her own home, measuring her words carefully, trying to anticipate Kwesi's moods. The special weaving room he had built for her, once a sanctuary of creativity and peace, became a place of tension. She would watch through its window as he paced in their courtyard, talking to himself, making grand plans for trades that never materialized. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and long shadows crept across their floor, Kwesi returned home earlier than usual. His eyes were clear, and for a moment, Zara's heart lifted at the sight of his familiar smile. He sat beside her at the loom, watching her work as he had done so many times before. "I've been foolish," he said softly, his voice carrying echoes of the man she had married. "But I have a plan now. There's a merchant from the southern ports who's offered me a partnership. One last chance to rebuild everything we've lost." Zora's hands trembled slightly as she guided her shuttle through the warp threads. She had heard him speak of plans before, each one grander than the last, each ending in deeper disappointment. But the hope in his voice made her want to believe. "What kind of partnership?" she asked carefully. "I need to borrow against our home," he said, his words stumbling out faster now. "Just for a short while. The returns will be 10 times what we invest. 20 times. We'll be richer than we ever were before." The shuttle slipped from Zora's fingers, clattering to the floor. The sound seemed to break something in the air between them. Kwesi's face darkened, the familiar shadows creeping back into his eyes. "You don't trust me," he growled, rising to his feet. "After everything I've done for you, you sit there judging me like all the others." As night fell over the mountain village, the sound of breaking pottery and angry shouts echoed from their home. The neighbors turned their faces away, pretending not to hear, while in the darkness, the first seeds of fear took root in Zara's heart. The first storm. The morning after Kwesi's outburst about the loan, Zora rose before dawn as she always had. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar motions of lighting the morning fire, though her mind was troubled like water stirred by a storm. As she prepared the morning meal, her eyes kept straying to the broken pieces of pottery that still littered the floor, each shard a reminder of how quickly peace could shatter. Kwesi emerged from their sleeping chamber with bloodshot eyes and a face dark with shame. For a moment, he stood in the doorway, looking at the destruction he had caused the night before. Then, without a word, he began picking up the broken pieces. Zora's heart lifted slightly at this gesture, perhaps the light of day had restored some of his reason. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice rough. "I don't know what came over me last night. Things have been difficult." He crossed the room and took her hands in his. "But you understand, don't you? You've always understood me better than anyone." Zara wanted to believe in the sincerity she heard in his voice. She wanted to believe that the man she had married was still there, merely hidden beneath layers of worry and whine. But something had changed inside her, like a thread pulled loose from a carefully woven pattern. "Perhaps," she suggested gently, "we could speak to Elder Kent about the trade routes. He has connections in the northern markets that might." The change in Kwesi's expression was instant, like lightning splitting a clear sky. His grip on her hands tightened painfully. So you have been talking about me to the elders? Spreading stories about our private affairs? No, I only meant. The slap came without warning, sharp and shocking as a branch snapping in the wind. Zara stumbled backward, her hand flying to her cheek, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Kwesi stood frozen, staring at his own hand as if it belonged to a stranger. Zara, he whispered, horror creeping into his voice. I didn't mean, you made me so angry, talking about the elders, questioning my judgment. She stood perfectly still, feeling the sting of the blow fade into a dull throb. In all the stories she had heard, in all the patterns she had woven, she had never imagined herself in this moment. The Kwesi she knew, the man who had spoken so tenderly of captured souls, seemed to have vanished like morning mist before the sun. That evening, he brought her a gift, a small pot of the purple dye she had been wanting for her weaving. His eyes were clear, his manner contrite. He spoke of his regret, of the pressure he was under, of how much he needed her support. He promised it would never happen again. But promises, Zara was learning, could be as fragile as spider webs in the wind. The next incident came a week later, after Kwesi returned home to find Zara discussing prices with a merchant from the coastal regions. The fact that she was selling her tapestries directly, without going through him, sent him into a rage that left her with bruises on her arms and a cut on her lip. You're trying to shame me, he shouted, his words slurred with palm wine. Making deals behind my back, showing everyone that you don't need me. Is that what you want? To make me look worthless in front of the whole village? Zara tried to explain that she was only trying to help, to bring in some income while his trading was slow. But her words seemed to enrage him further. That night, for the first time, she barred the door to her weaving room and slept there, listening to him rage and storm through the house. The pattern of their life together began to change, like a beautiful tapestry slowly unraveling. Good days would follow bad ones, moments of tenderness would be shattered by sudden violence. Kwesi would alternate between passionate remorse and brutal anger, between loving words and cruel accusations. Some mornings, he would bring her breakfast as she worked at her loom, speaking softly of his plans to make things right. He would help her arrange her threads, almost like he used to, and Zora's heart would ache with hope. But by evening, the palm wine would erase his gentleness, leaving only shadows and fury in its wake. The villagers began to notice. Women would fall silent when Zara passed, their eyes following the careful way she moved, the long sleeves she wore even in the heat. Some tried to speak with her, offering veiled questions about her welfare, but she had learned to smile and deflect their concern. After all, what could they do? Marriage was sacred, private, these were the teachings she had grown up with. At night, lying alone in her weaving room, Zara would run her fingers over her latest work, a tapestry showing a storm approaching a peaceful village. The dark clouds she had woven seemed to mirror the darkness that had crept into her own life. But in the corner of the piece, almost hidden among the threads, she had woven a small bird taking flight. Even as her body bore the marks of Kwesi's anger, even as fear became her constant companion, something was awakening inside her. Like a seed pushing through hard soil, like a spring finding its way through rock, a new strength was growing. She didn't recognize it yet, couldn't name it, but it was there, in the way she began hiding small coins in the hem of her dress, in the quiet determination with which she continued to weave, in the dreams of freedom that visited her in the darkest hours of the night. One evening, as she heard Kwesi's unsteady footsteps approaching the house, Zara looked at her reflection in the polished copper mirror he had once brought her from a distant market. The woman who looked back at her was changed, thinner, wearier, but with something fierce burning in her eyes. She touched the fresh bruise on her cheek and made a silent promise to herself. This storm would not break her. Somehow, someday, she would find a way to weave a new pattern for her life. Broken trust. The season of heavy rains came to the mountain village, and with it, a darkness deeper than the storm clouds that gathered above. Kwesi's gambling debts had grown like weeds after the rain, choking out what little remained of their former prosperity. The beautiful home he had built for them, once filled with the treasures of his trade and the artwork of Zora's loom, began to empty piece by piece. First went the copper mirror, then the carved wooden chest that had held Zora's finest threads. Each time Kwesi took something to sell, he would promise to replace it tenfold when his luck turned. But his luck, like his promises, had become as unreliable as smoke in the wind. One morning, Zora woke to find him standing over her precious loom, eyeing it with a calculating gaze that made her blood run cold. "This could fetch a good price in the northern markets," he muttered, running his hand along the polished wood. "Enough to cover my debt to Malik, maybe even with something left over to invest." "No." The word came from somewhere deep inside Zora, a place she hadn't known existed until that moment. "Not my loom. It's all I have left." Kwesi turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "All you have left?" His voice was dangerously soft. "What about me? Am I nothing? After everything I've done for you, you choose a piece of wood over helping your husband." "The loom is how I make our living now," Zora replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Since you..." She stopped, seeing the familiar darkness cross his face. "Since I what?" He stepped closer, the smell of last night's palm wine still clinging to him. "Since I failed." "Is that what you were going to say?" "That's what everyone in this cursed village whispers behind my back, isn't it?" The beating that followed was the worst yet. When Kwesi finally stumbled out of the house, Zora lay curled on the floor, tasting blood in her mouth. But her eyes remained fixed on her loom, standing silent and untouched in the corner. A small victory, paid for in pain and fear. That afternoon, as she pressed cool cloths to her swollen face, a knock came at her door. It was Aisha, the potter's wife, whose eyes widened at the sight of Zora's injuries. "Oh, child," she whispered, reaching out to touch Zora's cheek. "This cannot continue." But Zora stepped back, turning her face away. "It's nothing," she said automatically. "I fell." "We all hear the shouting, the breaking things," Aisha persisted. "My husband says Kwesi has been seen with dangerous men in the valley towns. Men who collect debts with knives, not words." "You must." "Please," Zara interrupted, her voice cracking. "Please leave. If he comes back and finds you here." The fear in her voice must have convinced Aisha, who left with tears in her eyes. After she was gone, Zara sat at her loom, her hands trembling as they moved through the familiar motions. The tapestry taking shape beneath her fingers showed a woman standing alone in a dark forest, surrounded by shadows with gleaming eyes. That night, Kwesi didn't come home. Zara sat in the darkness, listening to the rain drum against the roof, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally came, she heard voices in the village square, angry voices, growing louder. Peering through her window, she saw a group of merchants confronting the village elders. "Kwesi has cheated us," one of them shouted, his face red with fury. "He took our goods on credit, promising to pay double after the northern market. But he never went north, he sold everything in the coastal towns for cheap, then gambled away the money." The elders tried to calm the situation, speaking of patience and proper procedures. But the merchants would not be appeased. "We know he has a wife who makes valuable tapestries," another called out. "Let her pay his debts with her work." Zora's heart nearly stopped. In that moment, she understood that Kwesi hadn't just destroyed their marriage, he had endangered everything she had built, everything she was. The reputation she had earned through years of dedicated work could be swept away by his actions, like leaves in a storm. She spent the day frantically hiding her most precious possessions, her best needles, her finest threads, the small store of coins she had managed to save. As darkness fell, she heard Kwesi's familiar stumbling step on the path. But this time, other footsteps accompanied his. He burst through the door with 3 rough-looking men behind him. Their eyes roamed the house, taking in what little of value remained. Kwesi's face was a mask of desperate bravado. "See," he said to them. "I told you my wife is the finest weaver in all the mountain villages. Her work will more than cover what I owe you. Show them, Zara. Show them the tapestries you've been working on." Zara stood frozen, feeling the weight of the stranger's greedy stares. One of them stepped toward her weaving room, but she moved to block the doorway. "No," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Kwesi's face contorted with rage. "No. You dare say no to me? In front of my business partners?" He grabbed her arm, trying to pull her aside, but she held her ground. "Your business partners?" She looked at the men, seeing the violence in their stance, the weapons poorly concealed beneath their cloaks. "Or the men you owe money to? The ones who will take everything we have left and still want more." The blow caught her on the side of the head, sending her stumbling against the wall. Through blurred vision, she saw one of the men grab Kwesi's arm. "Enough," he growled. "We didn't come here to watch you beat your wife. You promised us valuable goods to settle your debt. Where are they?" What followed was like a nightmare. They ransacked the house, taking anything that might have value. Zara watched, helpless, as they stripped away the last remnants of her former life. But when they reached for her loom, something inside her snapped. "Touch it and I'll burn it," she said, holding up a lamp. "I'll destroy it before I let you take it. Then you have nothing." Perhaps it was the steel in her voice, or the wild light in her eyes, but the men hesitated. After a tense moment, they left, dragging a protesting Kwesi with them. "You have 1 week," their leader called back. 1 week to pay what he owes, or we'll return. And next time, we won't be so gentle." Alone in her violated home, Zara sank to the floor. The trust she had placed in Kwesi, the love she had felt for him, the dreams they had shared, all of it lay in ruins around her, like the shattered pieces of her life. But as she looked at her loom, still standing proud and untouched in the corner, a small flame of determination flickered in her heart. She had protected her means of creating, of sustaining herself. Now she would have to find the strength to protect herself as well. The Elders' Council. In the grey hours before dawn, when the mountain mist still clung to the earth like a mother's embrace, Zora made her way to the house of Elder Kent. Her body ached from Kwesi's latest assault, and the threat of the debt collectors hung over her like a storm cloud, but she had run out of alternatives. Surely the village elders, with their wisdom and authority, would know how to help her. Elder Kent's compound sat at the heart of the village, its walls decorated with ancient symbols of protection and justice. As Zora approached, she saw smoke rising from the morning fire, where the elder's wife, Mama Kent, was already preparing the day's first meal. The old woman's eyes widened at the sight of Zora's bruised face, but she said nothing as she led her to where the elder sat in his receiving room. Elder Kent was the oldest and most respected member of their community. His white hair gleamed in the early morning light, and his eyes held the wisdom of countless seasons. He listened in silence as Zora told her story, of Kwesi's descent into drinking and gambling, of the violence that had become a shadow in their home, of the dangerous men who now threatened them both. When she finished speaking, the elder sat for a long moment, running his fingers over the carved staff that symbolized his authority. "These are indeed troubled waters," he said finally. "But marriage is like a mighty baobab tree, its roots run deep, and it must weather many storms to grow strong." Zora's heart sank at his words. "But elder," she ventured carefully, "what if the storm is not outside the tree, but within it? What if the roots themselves are poisoned?" The elder's face darkened slightly. "You speak of your husband with disrespect," he chided. Kwesi is going through difficult times, yes, but it is a wife's duty to support her husband, to help him find his way back to the right path. I have tried, Zara whispered, her hands twisting in her lap. But he grows more violent with each passing day. These men he owes money to, they are dangerous. I fear for my life. Fear is like a small seed, Elder Kent replied, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of traditional teachings. If we let it grow, it can choke out the flowers of love and trust. You must have patience, daughter. Help Kwesi restore his honor. Perhaps if you were to sell some of your tapestries. He wants to sell my loom, Zara interrupted, then immediately lowered her eyes, ashamed of speaking out of turn. Forgive me, elder, but my weaving is all we have left. If I lose my loom, how will we survive? The elder sighed heavily. Sometimes we must sacrifice our personal desires for the greater good of the family. Your husband's reputation in the community must be restored. This is more important than any possession, even your loom. At these words, Mama Kent, who had been silently preparing tea in the corner, dropped a clay cup. It shattered on the floor, the sound sharp as breaking bones in the quiet room. The old woman's hands trembled as she bent to clean up the pieces, and Zora caught a glimpse of ancient scars on her wrist, usually hidden beneath her bracelets. Perhaps, Mama Kent said softly, not looking up from the broken cup, the young one could stay with us for a few days, until things calm down. But Elder Kent shook his head firmly. A wife's place is with her husband. What would people say if we separated a married couple? No, Zora must return home and face this challenge with dignity and patience. He reached for his medicine pouch, drawing out some herbs wrapped in leaves. Here, he said, pressing them into her hands. Make a tea from this when your husband grows angry. They will calm his spirit. And I will speak with him about the gambling, remind him of his duties as a husband and a member of our community. Zora clutched the herbs, feeling their brittle leaves crumble in her grip. She had come seeking protection, justice, intervention, and was being sent back with leaves and platitudes. The weight of generations of tradition pressed down on her like a heavy blanket, threatening to smother the small flame of rebellion that had begun to burn in her heart. As she rose to leave, Mama Kent caught her arm. The old woman's eyes held a deep sorrow, and something else, a hint of steel that reminded Zora of her own grandmother. There is an old woman who lives near the forest spring, she whispered urgently. The one they call the wise woman. Perhaps she might have different counsel for you. Elder Kent cleared his throat disapprovingly, and his wife stepped back, her eyes downcast. But her words had planted a seed in Zora's mind, one that would take root alongside her growing determination to survive. Walking home through the village, Zora passed the temple where she and Kwesi had been married. The sacred marriage knot still hung above the door, its complicated pattern meant to symbolize the unbreakable bond between husband and wife. But now, with eyes opened by pain and fear, she saw something different in its twisting strands, not the beauty of connection, but the tangles of a trap. At her own door, she paused, listening for sounds from within. The house was silent, Kwesi presumably still away with his business partners. She touched the herbs in her pocket, feeling their useless comfort. The elders, bound by tradition and their own prejudices, could not or would not help her. As she stood there, a cool breeze carried the sound of running water from the direction of the forest spring. Mama Kent's words echoed in her mind, the wise woman, perhaps she might have different counsel. Zora straightened her shoulders, feeling the weight of her decision even as it lifted some of her despair. The elders had given her their counsel, rooted in the past like an ancient tree. But perhaps what she needed now was wisdom of a different kind, wisdom that, like water, could find new paths around old obstacles. The sun had fully risen now, burning away the morning mist. As Zora entered her house, she noticed that the shadows seemed a little less dark, the air a little less heavy. She had not found the help she sought from the elders, but she had found something else, the understanding that if she wanted to change the pattern of her life, she would have to seek wisdom from sources that the elders might not approve of. She sat at her loom, her fingers moving automatically through the familiar motions as her mind turned toward the forest spring and the mysterious woman who lived there. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she would seek a different kind of counsel. Whispers in the night. The path to the forest spring twisted through ancient trees, their branches woven together like the threads of destiny. Zora had waited until the moon was high, slipping out of her house while Kwesi lay in a drunken stupor. She carried nothing but a small clay lamp and the desperate hope that had driven her to seek out this forbidden counsel. Stories about the wise woman had circulated in the village for generations, whispered between women like secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. Some called her a witch, others a healer, and still others claimed she was as old as the mountains themselves. The elders discouraged any contact with her, saying her wisdom came from sources that defied the natural order. As Zora approached the spring, the sound of water grew louder, mixing with another sound, a low, melodic humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. The moonlight filtered through the leaves, creating patterns on the ground that moved like living things. There, beside the spring, sat the wise woman. She was not what Zora had expected. Instead of the fearsome crone of village tales, she saw a woman wrapped in indigo cloth, her silver hair bound with cowrie shells that gleamed in the moonlight. Her face bore the marks of age, but her eyes were sharp and clear as stream water. "I've been waiting for you, daughter of the loom," the woman said, her voice like wind through dry grass. "Your tapestries speak of shadows growing deeper, of bonds becoming chains." Zora felt a shiver run down her spine. "How do you know about my weaving?" The wise woman smiled, revealing teeth stained blue with indigo. "I know many things. I know that your husband's fists have painted purple flowers on your skin. I know that the elders gave you herbs for peace when you needed weapons for war. And I know that you are ready to learn what your grandmother's grandmother knew, before the men made us forget." She gestured for Zora to sit beside her on a smooth stone by the spring. From beneath her robes, she drew out a small bundle wrapped in leaves. "Do you know why they fear us, daughter? Not because we are weak, but because we are strong. They dressed our power in shame and called it wickedness, but they could not destroy it entirely." Unwrapping the bundle, she revealed a collection of small items, a spindle made of dark wood, threads of various colors, and a handful of seeds that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. "Your loom is not just a tool for making beautiful things," she said, picking up the spindle. "It is an instrument of power, of creation. Every pattern you weave is a spell, every thread a story waiting to be told." Through the night, the wise woman taught Zora secrets that had been passed down through generations of women, hidden from those who would destroy them. She learned about plants that could heal or harm, about words that could bind or release, about the ancient symbols that held power when woven into cloth. "But remember," the old woman warned, "these are not weapons for revenge. They are tools for survival, for protection, for reclaiming what was stolen from us. The greatest power lies not in hurting others, but in healing ourselves." As dawn approached, she gave Zora the spindle and a pouch of the glowing seeds. "Plant these by your loom," she instructed. "They will grow into flowers that only bloom at night, reminding you that strength often flourishes in darkness. And when you weave, use this spindle. It will help you create patterns that speak to the deepest parts of those who see them." Before Zora left, the wise woman grabbed her arm with surprising strength. "Listen carefully, daughter. Your husband's violence comes from his own weakness, his own fears. But that does not mean you must bear it. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do, for ourselves and others, is to break the bonds that harm us." She pressed something else into Zora's hand, a small stone, smooth and cold as moonlight. "Keep this with you. When you feel afraid, remember that fear is just power that has lost its way home. Find your power, daughter of the loom. Find it, and set it free. Walking home in the pre-dawn light, Zara felt different. The bruises on her body still ached, but something new had awakened inside her, something that felt ancient and familiar at the same time. She thought of all the women before her who had carried these secrets, who had found ways to survive and thrive despite the chains that bound them. At home, she planted the luminous seeds beside her loom and hid the spindle among her threads. Kwesi still lay where she had left him, unaware that his wife had begun a transformation as profound as the changing of seasons. She sat at her loom and began to weave, using the new spindle, watching as patterns emerged that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light. Her hands moved with newfound purpose, creating designs that spoke of liberation, of strength, of survival. Into the warp and weft, she wove the wisdom of the wise woman, the power of the moonlit spring, and her own growing determination to break free from the shadows that had threatened to consume her. As the sun rose over the mountain village, Zara continued to weave, each pass of the shuttle like a heartbeat, each pattern a step toward freedom. The night-blooming flowers began to sprout beside her loom, their buds holding the promise of secret blossoms yet to come. She understood now that her journey would not be easy, that breaking free would require more than just physical escape. She would need to unravel the very patterns that had bound her, the beliefs about duty and submission that had been woven into her mind since childhood. But for the first time since Kwesi's first blow had shattered her world, she felt truly awake, truly alive. The wise woman's words echoed in her mind, fear is just power that has lost its way home. Zara touched the smooth stone in her pocket and smiled. She had begun to find her way home to herself, and nothing, not tradition, not fear, not even Kwesi's fury, would stop her now. Seeds of strength. The night-blooming flowers beside Zara's loom grew swiftly, their stems spiraling upward like dreams reaching for the sky. By day, they appeared to be ordinary green plants, but in the darkness, they opened into blossoms that glowed with a subtle luminescence, their petals the color of moonlight on water. In their gentle light, Zara began her secret work. While Kwesi spent his days and nights pursuing increasingly desperate schemes to repay his debts, Zara transformed her weaving room into a sanctuary of quiet rebellion. Using the wise woman's spindle, she created tapestries unlike any she had woven before. The patterns seemed to shift and change depending on who looked at them. To most eyes, they were simply beautiful designs, but to those who knew how to look, they told stories of liberation and power. Word spread quietly among the village women about these new works. They began to come to her, one by one, under the pretense of buying thread or discussing patterns. But their real purpose was to whisper their own stories of pain and survival, to seek counsel and courage from the strange new light they saw in Zara's eyes. Aisha, the potter's wife, was the first to recognize the ancient symbols woven into the borders of Zara's tapestries, protection sigils and strength marks that her grandmother had once shown her in secret. These patterns, she whispered, running her fingers over the threads, they speak of things we were told to forget. Zara nodded, remembering the wise woman's words about knowledge that had been buried but never truly lost. She began teaching Aisha and other women how to incorporate these symbols into their own crafts, into the patterns pressed into clay pots, into the beadwork of jewelry, into the marks drawn on doorways to ward off harm. But more than just ancient symbols, Zara taught them practical wisdom. She showed them how to hide small caches of food and coins, how to create secret signals to warn each other of danger, how to strengthen their bodies and spirits against abuse. The night-blooming flowers became their signal. When their luminous petals were visible through Zara's window, it meant her room was open as a safe haven for any woman who needed shelter or counsel. During this time, Zara also began her own careful preparations. She established connections with traders from distant markets, women who would buy her tapestries directly, paying in small gold coins that she could easily hide. She learned which herbs could be used to make a man sleep deeply or to heal bruises quickly. She mapped escape routes through the mountain paths and memorized the locations of springs and shelter caves. Most importantly, she started weaving her masterwork, a tapestry unlike any other. Using the wise woman's spindle and threads dyed with secret formulas, she created a piece that seemed to capture light itself. Into it, she wove all the pain and fear she had experienced, but also all the strength and wisdom she had gained. The pattern was complex beyond understanding, seeming to move and change even as it was being created. The threads, remember, the wise woman had told her during one of their secret midnight meetings. They remember the hands that spun them, the plants that dyed them, the earth that grew the fibers. When you weave with intention, you are not just making cloth, you are making magic. Kwesi remained oblivious to these changes, seeing only what he expected to see, a subdued wife continuing her craft. When he was sober enough to notice her working on the masterwork tapestry, she told him it was commissioned by a wealthy merchant, promising that its sale would help pay his debts. In his desperation to believe in any possibility of salvation, he accepted this without question. But the tapestry was not for sale. It was Zora's own story, her declaration of independence being written in thread and color. Each time Kwesi struck her, each time he raged and threatened, she would return to her loom and weave that pain into power, that fear into strength. The bruises on her body became colors in her design, her tears became silver threads catching light. Other changes were happening too, subtle but significant. Zora noticed that her hands, once soft from working only with fine threads, had grown stronger. Her movements became more deliberate, her stance more grounded. The wise woman had taught her exercises to do while weaving, ways to strengthen her body and sharpen her mind while appearing to simply practice her craft. The women who came to her began to change as well. They walked differently, spoke more confidently, their eyes carrying the same quiet fire that had begun to burn in Zora's. They formed a silent network of support and resistance, sharing resources and knowledge, watching over each other's children, creating safe spaces in a world that offered them few protections. One evening, as Zora walked on her masterwork by the light of the night-blooming flowers, she heard heavy footsteps approaching, Kwesi, returning early and drunk. Instead of freezing in fear as she once would have, she quickly but calmly secured her special threads and spindle in their hiding place. When he burst in, raging about some new humiliation or failure, she faced him with a tranquility that seemed to confuse him. "You're different," he slurred, squinting at her in the dim light. "Something about you is different." "I am the same as I have always been," she replied softly, but they both knew it was a lie. She was changing, growing, becoming more fully herself with each passing day. The seeds of strength planted by the wise woman were blooming in ways that could no longer be completely hidden. That night, after Kwesi had passed out, Zara stood at her window looking up at the moon. The night-blooming flowers glowed beside her, their light reflecting off the threads of her masterwork tapestry. She touched the smooth stone the wise woman had given her, feeling its cool strength. The deadline set by Kwesi's creditors was approaching, and with it, the moment when she would need to put all her preparations to the test. But she was no longer the frightened woman who had first sought the wise woman's counsel. She had planted her seeds of strength, tended them carefully, and watched them grow. Now it was almost time to harvest what she had sown. Running her fingers over the complex patterns of her masterwork, Zora smiled in the darkness. Soon, very soon, the final threads would be woven, and the full pattern of her liberation would be revealed. The Sacred Circle. On the night of the new moon, when darkness wrapped the mountain village like a velvet cloak, women began slipping quietly through the shadows toward the forest spring. They came one by one, moving as silently as mist, Aisha the potter's wife, Mama Kent with her ancient eyes, young Folomi whose marriage was barely a season old, and others who had found their way to Zora's loom room over the past months. The wise woman waited for them by the spring, her indigo robes blending with the night. Beside her stood Zora, transformed from the broken woman who had first sought counsel here. She wore a shawl of her own weaving, created with the magical spindle, its patterns seeming to move in the starlight. "Welcome, sisters," the wise woman intoned, her voice carrying on the night breeze. "You have come seeking what was lost, what was taken, what was hidden. Tonight, we reclaim our sacred circle." The women settled in a ring around the spring, where the wise woman had laid out objects of power: Zora's spindle, a ball of thread that gleamed like moonlight, herbs that released sweet smoke into the air, and at the center, a small portion of Zora's masterwork tapestry, its incomplete pattern somehow more powerful for its unfinished state. "Long ago, the wise woman began, before men claimed the right to break our bodies and spirits, we gathered like this under the dark moon. We shared our strength, our wisdom, our magic. They called us witches, called us dangerous, called us wicked, because what is more threatening than women who know their own power?" One by one, the women began to speak, sharing their stories of pain and resistance. Aisha revealed the scars her husband's rage had left on her back. Fulomi spoke of her new husband's growing cruelty, the way his sweet words had turned to bitter commands. Others told of brothers who stole their inheritance, of fathers who sold them like cattle, of sons who had learned to despise them. But they also shared their triumphs, small acts of defiance, moments of courage, ways they had protected themselves and each other. Each story was a thread, weaving them together into something stronger than their individual fears. "See how they tried to separate us," the wise woman said, drawing a circle in the earth with her staff. "They knew that alone, a woman might be broken, but together." She cast something into the spring that made the water glow momentarily. "Together, we are unbreakable." Zara stepped forward, carrying her magical spindle. "The threads remember," she said, echoing the wise woman's teaching. "They remember when we were strong, when we were free, when we were sacred. Every time we weave, every time we create, we tap into that memory." She taught them the secret symbols she had learned, showing how they could be hidden in everyday objects: a protection sigil carved subtly into a cooking pot, a strength mark embroidered into a baby's blanket, a warrior's blessing woven into a belt. These were not just decorations but declarations of power, silent resistance hidden in plain sight. The wise woman moved among them, touching each woman's forehead with water from the spring. "You are not alone," she reminded them. "In your darkest moments, remember the circle. Remember that somewhere, your sisters are thinking of you, sending you strength, holding space for your courage to grow." As the night deepened, they began to plan. Not just for Zora's impending confrontation with Kwesi and his creditors, but for all of them. They mapped out safe houses where women could flee, arranged signals that could be sent across the village, organized ways to share resources and information. Mama Kent, who had been silent most of the night, finally spoke. "I have watched for too long," she said, her voice trembling. "I have upheld traditions that harm us, spoken words that bind us, turned away when I should have helped." She removed her bracelets, revealing the old scars on her wrist. "No more. Our daughters will know a different way." The women embraced her, understanding the courage it took to question beliefs held for a lifetime. This too was part of their circle, the space to change, to grow, to become more fully themselves. Before they dispersed, the wise woman gave each woman a small pouch containing a seed from the same plants that bloomed by Zora's loom. "Plant these in secret places," she instructed. "When they bloom in the darkness, remember this night. Remember that like these flowers, our strength often grows best in shadow." They left as they had come, one by one, carrying their seeds and their secrets back to homes that felt different now that they knew they weren't alone. The sacred circle wasn't just the physical ring they had formed around the spring, it was the invisible web of connection that linked them, the shared understanding that had been rekindled, the collective power they had remembered. Zara was the last to leave, staying behind to help the wise woman clear away the night's walkings. As she gathered the magical implements, she noticed something had changed in the unfinished portion of her masterwork tapestry. New patterns had appeared in the threads, as if the energy of the circle had woven itself into the fabric. The final confrontation approaches, the wise woman said, touching the tapestry gently. But now you face it with the strength of all your sisters behind you. Remember tonight, daughter. Remember that like your loom, we are strongest when all our threads are connected. Walking home through the sleeping village, Zora felt the power of the circle still humming in her blood. The seed in her pocket seemed to pulse with potential, like a tiny heart beating in rhythm with her own. Tomorrow she would return to her loom, to her unfinished masterwork, to the facade of submission she still needed to maintain. But everything had changed. She was no longer just working to free herself. She was part of something larger, something older, something that had survived countless attempts to destroy it. The sacred circle had been restored, and through it, each woman's individual struggle had become part of a greater pattern of resistance and renewal. As she reached her door, a night-blooming flower by her window opened its luminous petals to the darkness. Somewhere in the village, she knew, other women were watching similar blooms, remembering the circle, holding its power in their hearts. The seeds of revolution had been planted, and they would grow in the darkness until they were strong enough to break through into the light. The reckoning. The deadline set by Kwesi's creditors arrived with the season's first thunder, rolling across the mountains like drums of war. Zora sat at her loom, watching storm clouds gather through her window, her fingers steady as they wove the final threads of her masterwork. The night-blooming flowers beside her had grown tall and strong, their stems intertwining like the bonds of sisterhood formed in the sacred circle. She knew they were coming. Kwesi and his dangerous associates could feel their approach like a storm front moving across her skin. But she was ready. The last month had been spent in careful preparation, each detail woven into place as precisely as the threads in her tapestry. Throughout the village, women went about their daily tasks with heightened awareness. Aisha shaped her clay with extra care, knowing that each pot might need to serve as a hiding place. Mama Kent swept her courtyard, her eyes alert for the agreed-upon signals. Young Fulomi sang as she washed clothes by the stream, her voice carrying coded messages to the other women. When Kwesi burst through the door, followed by 3 men with hard eyes and harder fists, Zora didn't flinch. She continued weaving, her magical spindle dancing through the threads like moonlight on water. The masterwork tapestry nearly filled her loom now, its pattern so complex and beautiful that even the creditors paused to stare. "Where is it, woman?" the leader demanded, his voice rough as mountain granite. "Where's the money your husband owes us?" Zora's hands stilled on the loom. She turned to face them, and something in her steady gaze made the men step back. Gone was the fearful wife who had once trembled at their threats. In her place sat someone else, someone who carried ancient power in her bones. "You speak of debts," she said, her voice clear and strong. "But what of the debt owed to me? What of the promises broken, the trust shattered, the blood spilled on these floors?" Kwesi lurched forward, wine on his breath and rage in his eyes. "Shut your mouth. You dare speak to them like this? After everything I've done for you? Everything you've done?" Zara stood, drawing herself to her full height. The patterns in her shawl seemed to ride in the stormy light. "Yes, let's speak of everything you've done." She began to unwind her shawl, revealing the bruises, scars, and broken places he had left on her body. But she didn't stop there. With each mark revealed, she named the corresponding debt, the money she had earned that he had gambled away, the treasures he had sold, the dignity he had stripped from her piece by piece. The creditors shifted uncomfortably. They were used to violence, but this was different. This was truth being laid bare, and it carried a power they didn't understand. "You want payment?" Zora's voice took on a rhythmic quality, like the clicking of her loom. "Look around you. Look at what remains of our home. Everything of value, he has already taken and lost to you. Everything except this. She gestured to the masterwork tapestry, its patterns now seeming to pulse with their own inner light. The night-blooming flowers beside the loom had begun to glow, though the sun still hung in the storm-dark sky. This piece, she continued, is worth more than all his debts combined. Merchants from the coastal cities would pay a king's ransom for it. Take it, and our accounts are settled. The leader of the creditors stepped forward, reaching for the tapestry. But as his fingers touched the threads, he jerked back as if bound. In the complex patterns, he had seen something that made his blood run cold, all the violence he had ever inflicted, all the pain he had caused, woven into an undeniable testimony. One by one, each man approached the tapestry, and each recoiled. The magical threads showed each viewer their own truth, reflecting back the darkness in their souls while simultaneously offering a path to redemption. What kind of witchcraft is this? Kwesi stammered, his face pale. Not witchcraft, Zara corrected him. Woman's craft. The craft you tried to steal from me, to sell for your debts. The craft that saved me when you tried to break me. Thunder cracked overhead, and in that moment, every woman in the village raised her voice in a traditional work song. The sound carried through the streets, echoing off the mountains, dozens of women singing in harmony, their voices weaving together like threads in a tapestry. The creditors backed away from the loom, from Zora, from the undeniable power that filled the room. Even Kwesi seemed to shrink, his anger crumbling in the face of something he couldn't understand or control. The debt is settled, the leader of the creditors declared abruptly. We want no part of this, magic. Keep your tapestry, woman. But you, he turned to Kwesi, you are still bound to us. Come. They grabbed Kwesi, who was too shocked to resist, and dragged him toward the door. But before they could leave, Zara spoke one last time. Wait. She took up her magical spindle, now glowing like a captured star. You speak of being bound? Then let us speak of binding. With quick, sure movements, she began to weave one final pattern into the masterwork. As she walked, she spoke words taught to her by the wise woman, ancient words of unmaking and remaking, of breaking bonds and setting boundaries. The air in the room grew thick with power. The night-blooming flowers burst into full luminescence, their light reflecting off the threads of the tapestry. And in that light, something shifted, reality itself seemed to ripple like fabric in the wind. When it was done, when the last thread was secured and the last word spoken, Kwesi fell to his knees. The creditors released him, stepping back in confusion and fear. Something fundamental had changed, the power he had held over Zara, the bonds of abuse and fear that had tied them together, had been severed as cleanly as cut threads. Go, Zara commanded, and her voice carried the weight of generations of women who had survived, resisted, and reclaimed their power. Go, and never return to this place. The men fled, taking Kwesi with them, leaving Zora standing in her weaving room as the storm broke overhead. Rain poured down, washing the village clean, while lightning illuminated the patterns of her masterwork, now complete, now perfect, now humming with the power of liberation. Wings of freedom. In the days following the confrontation, the village seemed to breathe differently, as if the very air had been transformed by what had transpired in Zora's weaving room. The storm that had broken during the reckoning lasted 3 days, washing away old hearts and nourishing new beginnings. When it finally cleared, the night-blooming flowers had spread their seeds across the village, taking root in unexpected places. Zora's masterwork tapestry became a source of quiet pilgrimage. Women from neighboring villages would make the journey up the mountain paths, drawn by whispered stories of its power. Each viewer saw something different in its intricate patterns, their own struggles, their own potential for liberation, their own path to healing. Some wept before it, others stood in silent contemplation, but all left changed in some fundamental way. The network of women that had formed in secret now emerged into the light, though subtly, like plants turning toward the sun. Aisha's pottery studio became a sanctuary where women could speak freely of their troubles and find support. Mama Kent, no longer bound by the weight of tradition, began teaching young girls the old stories, not just the ones about obedience and duty, but the ones about women heroes, warriors, and wise ones. One morning, as Zora sat at her loom working on a new piece, she heard familiar footsteps approaching her door. She had known this moment would come, had seen it woven into the patterns of possibility. Elder Kent stood in her doorway, his face lined with the gravity of his purpose. "The village council has met," he announced formally. "We have decided that your marriage to Kwesi is dissolved. He has been banished from these mountains, and your home is now yours alone." Zora continued weaving as she replied, "The dissolution of my marriage was not yours to decide, Elder. It was accomplished the moment I chose to free myself. But I accept your recognition of what has already been done." The elder shifted uncomfortably, unused to such direct speech from a woman. But times were changing, and he was wise enough to recognize it. "There is another matter," he continued. "The council has created a new position. We need someone to represent the interest of women in our deliberations, someone who understands both the old ways and the new." Now Zora's hands stilled on her loom. She looked up at him, seeing the genuine respect in his eyes. "And you offer this position to me?" "You have shown wisdom and strength," he replied. "And?" He glanced at her masterwork tapestry, his expression troubled by whatever he saw in its depths. "You have access to knowledge we didn't know still existed." Zora considered the offer carefully. "I will serve," she said finally, "but not alone. This position must be shared among the women of the village, for our strength lies in our unity, not in any individual's power." And so began a new chapter in the village's history. The sacred circle that had formed in secret became a recognized force for change. Women's voices, once silenced, joined in the discussions that shaped community life. The patterns of power began to shift, like threads being rewoven into a new design. Zora's home transformed as well. She took in apprentices, not just to learn weaving, but to learn all the forms of power she had discovered. The night-blooming flowers flourished in her garden, their luminous petals a reminder that beauty could grow even in darkness. Her loom room became a place of teaching and healing, where women could discover their own magic, their own strength. The wise woman still lived by the forest spring, but now women walked openly on the path to her door. The knowledge she had preserved through generations of suppression began to flow freely again, like a spring unsealed. She and Zora worked together, blending ancient wisdom with new understanding, teaching others how to find the power in their crafts, their bodies, their voices. Years passed, and Zora's story became part of the village's oral tradition, though it changed in the telling. Some versions emphasized the magic, others the practical resistance, but all spoke of the night-blooming flowers that had spread throughout the mountain villages, glowing with possibility in the darkness. One evening, as Zora sat with her apprentices while they worked at their looms, a young girl asked her, "Were you afraid when you stood against your husband and his creditors?" Zora touched the smooth stone she still carried, the one the wise woman had given her so long ago. "Fear is natural," she replied, "but it does not define us. What matters is what we weave from our fear, whether we let it bind us or use it to fly free." She stood and walked to the window, where the night-blooming flowers glowed beneath the stars. In the distance, she could see other luminous blooms dotting the village, each one marking a home where women had claimed their power, where the old magic flowed freely, where the sacred circle remained unbroken. "Remember," she told her students, her voice carrying the strength of one who had transformed pain into power, "every woman is born with wings. Some of us forget this, beaten down by the weight of others' expectations and fears. But the ability to soar remains, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be reclaimed." The night air carried the sound of women's voices raised in song, not the secret harmonies of resistance now, but the clear, strong melodies of those who knew their own worth. In homes throughout the village, looms clicked and spindles turned, each thread charged with intention, each pattern containing stories of survival and triumph. Zara returned to her own loom, where a new tapestry was taking shape. Its design spoke not of past struggles but of future possibilities, of daughters growing up knowing their power, of communities transformed by the recognition of women's wisdom, of ancient knowledge flowing freely into new forms. As she wove, the magical spindle danced through her fingers, catching starlight and dreams, weaving them together into something real and tangible. The night-blooming flowers swayed gently in the breeze, their luminous petals reflecting in the threads of her work. This, too, was freedom, not just the breaking of chains, but the creation of new patterns, new possibilities, new ways of being. Every piece she wove now carried this message, spreading hope throughout the mountains like seeds on the wind, that where women gather in circles of trust, where they remember their ancient power, where they weave their stories together, liberation blooms like flowers in the night, transforming darkness into light, fear into flight, ending into new beginning.